Sometimes, the people who hold power over your life think that makes them untouchable. My landlord raised my rent by 80% just to prove he could. But what he didn't know was that the very greed he used to push me out would become the reason I now own the building he lost. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. When I first saw the letter slid under my door, I thought it was just another maintenance notice. Maybe an update about the water shutoff schedule or trash pickup. But as soon as I unfolded the page and saw the bold number, my hands went cold. An 80% rent increase, effective immediately. I must have read it 3 times before I truly processed what it meant. My rent, which I'd budgeted down to the penny for years, was about to almost double. No explanation, no conversation. Just a smug, typed demand from my landlord, Greg, signed at the bottom like a slap in the face. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I called him that same afternoon, trying to stay calm. Hey Greg, I just got this notice. I think there's an error on the new rent amount. But his voice on the other end wasn't confused. It was amused. Not an error, he said, a chuckle slipping through the phone. The market's up, and I'm adjusting to reflect that. You're getting a great deal, honestly. I could have raised it more. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. 80% isn't an adjustment, Greg. That's extortion. He laughed again. The kind of laugh that told me he'd already decided how this conversation would end. You can always move out if you can't afford it, he said. Someone else will take it in a heartbeat. That was it. No negotiation, no decency, just raw arrogance. When I hung up, I sat on the edge of my couch in silence, staring at the letter on my coffee table. My apartment, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a stranger's space. Every corner, every picture frame, every cozy little imperfection felt temporary. Greg had turned my home into a countdown clock. It wasn't just the rent hike. It was the principle. I'd lived there for almost 7 years. Paid every bill on time. Reported issues politely. Never caused trouble. The idea that he could just snap his fingers and take it all away. It felt cruel. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts circled around one word. Powerless. But somewhere beneath the panic, a small spark of defiance started to form. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I looked around my apartment, at the worn hardwood floors I'd polished myself, the plants I'd nurtured on the windowsill, the quiet hum of the city outside. This wasn't just a place I rented. It was my home, and no arrogant landlord was going to bully me out of it without a fight. The next morning, I made myself a strong cup of coffee and opened my laptop. I started researching tenant laws, rent control regulations, anything that could explain whether what Greg did was even legal. My fingers trembled as I typed, but every click steadied me a little more. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a rent increase. It was about power. Who had it? Who abused it? And who could take it back? And that realization was the beginning of everything that came next. Before everything unraveled, life in that little apartment was quiet, predictable, and at least for me comfortable in its simplicity. I lived on the second floor of a slightly aging brick building tucked on a tree-lined street, the kind of place that smelled faintly of coffee and old wood when the sun warmed the hallways. I'd been there for almost 7 years. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The plumbing made strange noises in the winter. and the heat sometimes cut out for a few hours before sputtering back to life, but it was home. I worked from there as a freelance designer, so my days were spent surrounded by sketches, coffee mugs, and the soft hum of my computer. The walls held memories. The corner where I'd put up my first framed project. The balcony where I'd spent long evenings reading during the pandemic. The kitchen where I learned to bake just to fill the silence. That apartment represented independence, stability, my little piece of peace in a noisy world. And then there was Greg. Greg had owned the building for about 3 years. He was in his 40s, always dressed in a crisp polo and shiny loafers, and had that kind of careless confidence that comes from inherited money. He liked to remind people he flipped properties for fun, as if we were all lucky to live in one of his investments. At first, he wasn't terrible, just dismissive. He'd ignore repair requests for months, then show up suddenly with an air of irritation, as though fixing the heating or unclogging a drain was a personal favor. But over time, his attitude hardened into something meaner. He started showing up with potential buyers, wandering through the halls and pointing at apartments like he was shopping for upgrades. Once, I overheard him telling a young couple, "These old tenants are a drag on the profits." But not for long. That was my first warning sign. I remember the day vividly. He'd come by to inspect the unit, though it was obvious he just wanted to see if I'd made any changes. I offered him a glass of water, trying to be polite. He waved it away and leaned against the doorframe. "You know," he said casually, "I've been thinking about doing some upgrades around here. New paint, modern appliances, better floors. I could probably triple the rent once that's done." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. Triple? No one around here would pay that much. He gave me a small smirk, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, someone will. People always do." There was something in his tone that unsettled me, a mixture of arrogance and certainty, like he was talking about pieces on a chessboard, rather than human beings with lives and limits. From then on, things shifted. Maintenance requests started going unanswered. Emails got shorter and colder. He'd park his luxury car right in front of the building and stroll through the lobby, with a new watch every few weeks. Meanwhile, the rest of us nurses, teachers, freelancers tightened our budgets and crossed our fingers that our rents wouldn't rise. He liked control. You could see it in every interaction. If someone questioned him, he'd smirk and make them feel small. If a tenant pushed back on an expense, he'd send a reminder about late fees, even when there weren't any. But for a long time, I tolerated it, because moving wasn't easy. And despite his arrogance, I loved that apartment. It was the one place that still felt mine. Looking back now, I can see that the signs were there: the careless laughter, the power games, the veiled threats hidden behind business talk. Greg saw us not as people, but as assets. Still, at that time, I tried to stay optimistic. I told myself he was just a little greedy, not malicious. That if I kept my head down, paid my rent, and stayed out of trouble, I'd be fine. I was wrong. Because soon, Greg would cross a line that no decent person could justify. And once he did, there was no going back. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning. One of those quiet, gray days where the air feels heavy and the world moves a little slower. I'd just finished a client call and was tidying up my workspace when I heard the familiar scrape of paper sliding under my door. I figured it was another maintenance notice, or maybe an overdue response to the repair requests I'd been sending for weeks. The ceiling above my bathroom had started showing water stains again, and I'd been politely reminding Greg about it, But when I bent down and saw the thick white envelope with his company logo stamped across the front, my stomach tightened. I sat at my kitchen table, opened it carefully, and read the first line. Dear tenant, this is to notify you of an adjustment to your monthly rent. Effective next month, your new rate will be. My eyes stopped there. The number looked wrong. Impossibly wrong. I blinked, reread it, and felt the blood drain from my face. An 80% increase, 80. I whispered the word out loud, hoping it would sound less ridiculous if I said it. It didn't. I checked the date, checked the signature, checked everything, convinced I'd misunderstood. But it was all there in black and white. No typo, no mistake, just greed, written neatly in professional font. When I finally called Greg, I was still trying to be calm, still clinging to the idea that this could be reasoned out. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Greg, I began carefully. I just got this rent notice. There must be a mistake. It says... He cut me off with a small, sharp laugh. No mistake, he said. You've been underpaying for years. I'm adjusting to market value. Market value? I repeated. Greg, that's an 80% jump. You can't just... I can, he interrupted, his tone flat and smug. The lease allows for an increase upon renewal. If you can't afford it, I'll have no trouble filling your unit. Demands through the roof. For a second, I couldn't find words. I just stared at the phone, trying to process the audacity. He wasn't negotiating or explaining. He was enjoying this. Greg, I finally said, you know this is impossible for me. I've lived here for years, paid on time, taken care of the place. Then consider this your notice, he said, his voice hardening. You've got 30 days to decide. Pay the new rent or vacate. Either way, I win. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the silent phone in my hand. I felt something deep and unfamiliar, a mixture of anger and humiliation. I'd always believed that if you were reasonable and respectful, people would meet you halfway. But Greg didn't live in that world. His version of fairness was profit. That evening, I ran into Mrs. Alvarez from downstairs in the lobby. She looked shaken, clutching an identical envelope in her hand. Did you get one too? She asked quietly. I nodded. Her rent had gone up nearly as much as mine. Another tenant, a young nurse named Carla, joined us moments later. Same story, that it wasn't just me. Greg was squeezing everyone. He'd been planning this. The inspections, the smug comments about market rates, the casual way he dismissed repairs. It had all been leading here. He wanted us out, one way or another, so he could gut the place, modernize it, and rent to wealthier tenants. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the glass. Every creak of the building sounded different now, like a countdown to eviction. But beneath the fear, something began to shift inside me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just anxious. I was angry, righteously angry. I realized this wasn't just about rent. It was about control, about a man who thought he could push people around. Because he had the paperwork on his side, Greg had crossed a line. And as much as I didn't know how yet, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let him win. The days after that phone call felt surreal, as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted and I hadn't quite caught my balance yet. Everywhere I looked in my apartment, the plants on the windowsill, the coffee mug I used every morning, the soft indent in the couch where I always sat, I saw an expiration date stamped in invisible ink. But I wasn't the only one. The building had turned tense and quiet. Neighbors whispered in hallways. Doors closed faster than usual. And the friendly smiles we once exchanged turned into worried glances. Everyone had gotten the same letter. Some even worse. Greg had declared war on his own tenants. At first, I tried to reason with him again, still holding onto some thread of decency I thought might exist in him. I called, emailed, even stopped him in the hallway one morning when he came by unannounced to inspect the property. He was wearing his usual smug grin, sunglasses perched on his head like a crown. "Greg, you can't just do this," I said, following him as he strolled through the lobby. "The law caps increases at a certain percentage. You're breaking the rules." He didn't even look at me. "Those laws only apply under specific conditions. And this building doesn't qualify," he said lightly. "I've done my research." I could tell from the way he said it that he hadn't done any research at all. He just assumed I hadn't either. When I pressed again, he turned, smile thinning. "Look, it's simple," he said. "You either pay or you leave. But I'd suggest leaving. The place needs better tenants anyway." Then he winked, actually winked, and walked out, leaving the smell of expensive cologne and arrogance in his wake. That was when I realized this wasn't just business for him. He enjoyed this. The control, the fear, the feeling of power over people's lives. It wasn't about money. It was about dominance. Within a week, he started pushing harder. The heat went out again, right in the middle of a cold snap. When we called to report it, his voicemail was full. The maintenance guy, who'd always been reliable before, told me quietly that Greg had cut his hours. "He's saving money," he said with a shrug, eyes apologetic. A few days later, the hallway lights went out and stayed that way for nearly a week. Greg blamed the electrical company, though the rest of the block was perfectly lit. Then came the worst insult of all. He began showing the building to potential buyers while we were still living there. I came home one afternoon to find a group of people wandering through the hall with Greg leading them like a tour guide. He was talking loudly about massive profit potential and underutilized space, as if we were invisible. When he saw me, he smiled that cold smile and said, "Oh, this is one of the long-term tenants. She'll be moving soon, of course." He said it right in front of me. I didn't even know what to say. My throat tightened with fury, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my temper would have been exactly what he wanted. That night, I lay awake listening to the radiator hiss. I could feel the humiliation still burning under my skin. Every time I thought about his smirk, the casual way he dismissed me, dismissed all of us, my chest tightened. He thought we were powerless, and I'll admit, for a while, I believed him. I spent hours searching listings, crunching numbers, trying to imagine where I'd go. Everywhere was more expensive. Every option felt worse. The idea of packing up 7 years of my life because of his greed made me sick. Then, one afternoon, I overheard Carla, the nurse from the 3rd floor, crying in the hallway. Greg had left another voicemail for her, threatening legal action if she didn't sign the new lease by the end of the week. I remember putting a hand on her shoulder. "Don't let him scare you," I told her. "He's bluffing." But as I said it, I realized I didn't entirely believe it myself. Greg wasn't bluffing. He was escalating. He was turning up the pressure until we'd all break. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel trapped, not just financially, but emotionally. When someone controls the roof over your head, they control your sense of safety, your peace, your home. And Greg was stripping that away piece by piece, smiling while he did it. Still, something inside me refused to give in. I didn't know how yet, but I was done being scared. If he wanted to make this ugly, I'd stop pretending we were playing fair. He'd drawn the battle lines. Now it was my turn to find a way to fight back. Asterisk, it had been weeks since Greg's rent hike letter turned my life upside down, and every day felt heavier than the one before. The building, once full of quiet laughter and small talk, now hummed with tension. People spoke in whispers, eyes darting toward the stairwell like Greg might appear at any moment. The nights were the hardest. The radiators had stopped working altogether, and the air inside my apartment carried a biting chill. I'd learned to sleep with 2 sweaters and thick socks, huddled under every blanket I owned. Each time I exhaled, I could see my breath fog in the air. Still, I stayed. Moving wasn't an option, and giving up wasn't in me. One night, I woke to the sound of water, not the quiet drip of a leaky faucet, but a steady, echoing splash, splash, splash. I stumbled toward the bathroom, my feet cold against the tile, and froze. A stream of brownish water was pouring from the ceiling. The same spot I'd reported 3 times already. It was coming down fast, pooling across the floor, seeping toward the hallway. My towels weren't enough. Buckets, bowls, anything I could grab. I lined them up, working frantically to contain the flood. By the time I sat down, exhausted and soaked to the bone, I could feel anger rising in my chest like fire. It wasn't just the leak. It was every ignored email, every smirk, every little reminder that Greg thought he could treat us like pawns at 2 a.m. I sent him another message, calm but firm. Greg, the bathroom ceiling is leaking again. It's serious this time. Please send someone in the morning. The message showed read. No reply by the next afternoon. Still nothing. I called, and this time he picked up. Greg, it's flooding again, I said, keeping my voice steady. The ceiling could collapse if it keeps up. He sighed dramatically, like I was inconveniencing him. It's probably condensation. Just dry it out. Maintenance will check it when they can. When they can? I snapped. There's water pouring from the ceiling. I've reported this for months. It's not condensation, it's a burst pipe. There was a pause, and then his tone shifted, colder, condescending. Well, you could have avoided all this if you just signed the new lease, he said. I'd have had it all renovated by now. But if you want to live in a dump, that's on you. That was it. That was the moment something in me broke. Not the way you break when you cry or give up, but the kind of break that clears your mind, sharpens your resolve, and burns away fear. I hung up without another word. That night, I sat on the floor beside the buckets catching the leak and made a decision. I was done being a victim in Greg's little game. He'd made this personal. So would I. The next morning, as I stepped outside to go buy more cleaning supplies, I noticed something new, a shiny for sale sign planted right in front of the building. Greg's name was on it, in bold letters. My heart sank. It wasn't enough for him to drive us out. He wanted to cash in on our misery. Later that day, I overheard him in the hallway, showing another potential buyer around. He spoke loudly, his voice dripping with pride. Once I get these old tenants out, I'll be raking in triple the income. The place practically pays for itself. I froze behind my door, listening. That was the final straw. He wasn't just greedy, he was cruel. He wanted to humiliate us on his way to profit. For the first time, I didn't feel scared anymore. I felt focused. I wasn't sure how, but I knew I had to find a way to turn this around. To make him pay for every drop of water that fell from that ceiling. Every night I shivered in the cold. Every smug grin he'd thrown my way. He'd built his empire on arrogance. There had to be a crack somewhere. That night, I sat down at my computer and opened a new document titled Building Ownership Records, Research. I didn't even know what I was looking for yet. But something deep inside me whispered that the answer was out there. Greg had underestimated me. He thought I was just another powerless tenant. But I was done playing by his rules. That night, as I stared at the glow of my laptop screen, exhaustion and anger swirled together in my chest. But under it all, there was a strange clarity. I realized that Greg's entire strategy relied on fear and ignorance. He counted on us not knowing the law, not asking questions, not pushing back. That was his weakness. So I decided to turn my frustration into research. I started simple, searching property tax databases, tenant rights laws, local housing codes. The more I read, the more the threads began to connect. Greg's building had been family-owned for years, but when I dug deeper, I found something interesting. He hadn't inherited it at all. He'd bought it from a foreclosure auction just 2 years earlier. That meant he'd taken on certain tenant protection obligations under the city's Housing Stabilization Act. Obligations that included strict limits on rent increases, mandatory maintenance, and, most importantly, legal notice periods. He'd broken all of them. I sat back in my chair, heart racing. For the first time in weeks, I smiled, a small, quiet smile that came from knowing I finally had leverage. But I didn't stop there. The next day, I visited the local housing authority office in person. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a sharp tone, listened as I explained what Greg had been doing. The rent hikes, the ignored repairs, the harassment. When I mentioned the foreclosure purchase, she looked up sharply. "Wait," she said. "You're in a post-foreclosure multi-tenant unit." "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" She reached into a drawer, pulled out a thin packet, and slid it across the counter. "He's required by law to provide you with this notice and maintain rent stabilization for 3 years after acquisition. If he didn't, he's in violation of City Housing Code, Section 4.2b. I flipped through the papers, my pulse quickening. Every violation listed matched something Greg had done. Every single one. By the time I left that office, I wasn't just angry. I was armed. When I got home, I typed out a detailed summary of everything I'd found. Legal clauses, proof of neglect, tenant statements, even screenshots of his threatening messages. I organized it neatly in a folder titled Greg's Violations. Then, I started talking to my neighbors. Carla from the 3rd floor opened her door cautiously, eyes red from crying. When I explained what I'd found, her expression shifted from fear to disbelief. "He can't do that," she asked. "No," I said, holding out the papers. "And he's been counting on us not knowing that." By the end of the week, I had 6 tenants on board. We met every evening in the hallway, whispering like conspirators. Each of them shared their own story: missed repairs, intimidation, threats. When we compared notes, it became clear. Greg had been running this building like his personal fiefdom. We agreed on a plan. Step 1. Document everything. Photos of mold, leaks, broken locks, and unheated rooms. Step 2. File a formal complaint with the city's Housing Compliance Division. Step 3. Contact the local news outlet that had once done a segment on tenant abuse by slumlords. If Greg wanted a war, he was about to get one, fought on paper, in daylight, with every rule and regulation he thought didn't apply to him. Still, I knew better than to underestimate him. Greg wasn't the type to fold easily. If he found out what we were doing too soon, he'd retaliate. So we worked quietly, carefully. Every night, after the others went to bed, I'd sit by the window, the glow from the streetlight catching the edges of my notes. It felt strange, empowering, but also risky. I was walking a fine line between justice and revenge, and I knew one wrong move could blow everything up. But I didn't care. Greg had stripped away my peace, my comfort, my dignity. Now I was taking back something he could never buy: control. The following week, I received an email from the housing authority. "Your report has been received and escalated for investigation." I stared at it for a long time. It was short, formal, almost cold, but to me, it felt like victory. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. Little did I know, though, Greg wasn't about to sit quietly. He'd begun to sense the shift, the sudden confidence in the tenants, the whispers that stopped when he walked by. And men like Greg, they don't back down. They double down. And when he finally confronted me, it wouldn't be a quiet hallway argument. It would be all-out war. Asterisk when I said the fight would be all-out war, I didn't mean violence or shouting in the hallway. I meant strategy, paperwork, patience. Sitting in small rooms with tired people and turning frustration into a plan that moved like a machine, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. After the housing authority confirmed our complaints had merit, the next step surprised me. During a follow-up visit to the county records office, I found a notice tucked into a stack of public filings. Greg's property taxes were delinquent. Not a small oversight, months overdue. On a hunch, I dug deeper and discovered another thing. There was a notice of a mortgage default. The bank had the paperwork. If the taxes stayed unpaid and the loan stayed in default, the building could be seized and sold at a public auction. Reading those words, public auction, felt like finding a key under a doormat. It wasn't luck. It was an opening. Greg had built his life on leverage and pride. He'd assumed we'd be too afraid and uninformed to notice the cracks. He hadn't counted on us reading the fine print. I called a tenant meeting the next evening. We gathered in the back room of a cafe down the street, huddled around a scuffed wooden table under a dim lamp. There were 6 of us: Carla the nurse, Mrs. Alvarez, who'd lived here for 20 years, Marco from the floor above, who worked nights at a bakery, a young teacher named Priya, Tom the maintenance worker, and me. We passed around my folder, copies of the mortgage default notice, printed tax records, the housing authority emails, photographs of mold and leaks, and we planned. The first practical hurdle was obvious. Auctions are cash-heavy affairs, and none of us had the deep pockets of a property investor. But we weren't trying to outspend the market. We were trying to buy an opportunity and change the story. So we did what people do when they care more about a roof over their head than profit. We pooled what we had and looked for leverage. I took out what I could from a savings account I'd been keeping for emergencies. The money I'd meant to use for a down payment on a future place. Carla brought what her family could spare. Marco, who had a small inheritance, contributed. Priya had been saving for credentialing. She redirected half. Tom and Mrs. Alvarez scraped together what they had. It wasn't glamorous. Coin jars, small transfers. A modest loan from a community credit union that believed in tenant rights initiatives. We didn't aim to win by outbidding a real estate shark. We aimed to take the property at a fair price that covered the liens and made it possible to manage responsibly. Next came the logistics. None of us had formed an investment vehicle before, but the county clerk's office had a friendly young woman who explained what an LLC was and how quickly it could be formed. We chose a simple name, Northside Tenants LLC, and filed the paperwork that afternoon. We split ownership shares evenly and designated Tom to be the interim manager. Once ownership transferred, it felt strange and exhilarating to sign those papers. Our names, our initials, our tiny signatures committing to something bigger than any one of us. We prepared a clear, honest bid strategy. We'd research recent sales, calculate the liens and taxes due, and put forward an offer that wouldn't be rich enough for a speculator to prize after the math, but sufficient to satisfy the county and the lenders. We were realistic. This wasn't a chance to make money. This was about stability, dignity, and turning a building exploited into a home we could steward. The auction notice finally appeared on the county website. The date was circled on a paper calendar in my kitchen like a countdown. I remember the morning of the auction with the kind of hyper-awareness that makes small details stick. The sky was a flat pale blue. A cool wind pushed the scent of damp leaves through the street, and my hands felt steady as I put on the sweater I'd bought the week I signed my first big client. The 6 of us arrived at the courthouse early, a mismatched group in a sea of suited investors and real estate brokers. Auctions are strange rituals. People stood at lecterns, numbers flashed, lawyers moved like chess masters. Greg was there, of course, his face red, suit tighter than I remembered, gestures sharp and angry. He looked for a moment like a man who'd lost the script. He tried to buy time, negotiating with his bank, promising emergency payments. A flurry of phone calls and frantic handshakes. The bank's representative listened politely and then, with a clipped apology, said the remedy came too late. The liens were substantive, the default was recorded, and the auction would proceed. When our bid window opened, we made our move. We stood together, a quiet front among the murmurs. We bid not with bravado but with careful confidence, the amount to satisfy the county's claims, and give us a base from which to make repairs and seek community grants. Other bidders came in, a short, aggressive investor who tried to push us up, a pair of men who looked like they wanted a quick flip. But our number was sensible and firm. The room is a funny place where theater and math collide. You watch expressions change as numbers move. You learn how much weight a dollar can carry. Greg's face, when the final gavel fell and our LLC's name was read aloud, is a memory I still see sometimes. For a beat, he simply stood there, blinking as if reality had caught him in mid-sentence. His jaw tightened, and the color drained from his face. He muttered things under his breath, threats, promises of lawsuits. But the auction rules were clear. The county official read the paperwork. The clerk checked the registered names, and then, with a small, official nod, the property was ours. It wasn't cinematic in the way movies make it. There was no triumphant music swelling. There was the courthouse's fluorescent light, the rasp of papers, and a sudden, awkward silence. We filed our paperwork, made the required payments, and walked out into the cold air with our hands numb from the adrenaline. On the walk back to the building, people looked at us with curiosity. Some faces were open with hope. Greg watched from his car across the street, slumped and furious, a defeated figure behind tinted glass. We did not gloat. We were careful, aware that ownership brings responsibility, not just vindication. That evening, back in my apartment with the echo of the day sitting in my chest, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, relief paired with an honest, small joy. We'd taken control not by violence but by leveraging what we learned, pooling what we had, and refusing to be pushed out. The building, with its chipped paint and drafty windows, belonged to us now, to people who would care for it, not extract from it. I slept that night with a clarity that felt like the soft first light of morning. The battle had reached its most dangerous, decisive point, and we'd won it together. We still had work, repairs, legal filings, reorganization, but the center had shifted. The power Greg tried to wield for years had slid out of his hands and into ours. And as the city hummed outside my window, I let myself imagine something small and ordinary and beautiful. Neighbors talking in the hallway, without checking who had rights and who had tenants. A landlord who fixed a leak because it mattered, a building warmed by people who cared. That image, fragile and new, felt like the real prize. Asterisk the morning after the auction. I woke up to the sound of furious banging on my door. It wasn't subtle, sharp, rhythmic, and angry. I knew before I even got up who it was. When I opened the door, Greg stood there, his face a dangerous shade of red. His usually slicked back hair was in disarray, his tie hanging loose like he'd barely slept. He looked less like the smug landlord who'd taunted me for months and more like a man who'd just realized his entire world had slipped through his fingers. "You think this is over?" he spat, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you've done." I stayed calm, calmer than I expected to be. "Actually, Greg," I said quietly, "I know exactly what I've done. I've followed the law. Something you might want to try sometime." He laughed, a short, brittle sound that cracked in the air. "You think you're clever, huh? You think forming a little tenant club makes you a property owner? You're in way over your head, sweetheart." There it was again, that patronizing tone, the same one he'd used when he said market value. The same smirk that had fueled every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about eviction. But this time, the words didn't sting. They just rolled off me, like rain off a clean window. I folded my arms. "Greg, you lost the building fair and square. The county's records are already updated. The sale's been finalized. You don't have any legal claim anymore." His jaw tightened. He took another step forward, lowering his voice. "You think they'll actually let you keep it? You're just tenants, nobodies. The bank will eat you alive in maintenance costs, insurance, taxes." "We already spoke to the credit union," I interrupted, "and the housing department. We qualified for the community ownership grant for low-income tenants. So yes, Greg, we'll manage just fine." For a split second, I watched something flicker across his face. Disbelief, then recognition, and finally, fear. It was the look of a man realizing that the people he underestimated the most had beaten him at his own game. He tried to recover, of course. He scoffed, adjusted his tie, tried to sound composed. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "You'll regret this." I met his gaze evenly. "Maybe, but it's our mistake to make now." Behind me, I heard Mrs. Alvarez's door open, then Marco's, then Carla's. Within seconds, half the hallway had gathered, tenants who had lived under Greg's thumb for years, now standing shoulder to shoulder, silent but strong. Greg turned, saw them, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. "Leave, Greg," I said softly. "You're trespassing." He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for something cruel or clever to say. But nothing came out. His shoulders sagged. He muttered something under his breath and stormed toward the stairs. As he passed Mrs. Alvarez, she called after him, her voice steady but firm. "You forgot to fix my ceiling, Greg." The hallway broke into quiet, nervous laughter. Not mocking, not cruel, just free. He didn't look back by noon. His car was gone from the lot. 4 weeks after, we'd see him around the neighborhood sometimes, sitting in his car across the street, glaring at the building like it had betrayed him. But eventually, even that stopped. 2 months later, I got a call from a reporter at the local paper. Apparently, Greg's name had come up in another housing complaint investigation. Several other tenants across the city had filed against him, and the story was gaining traction. The headline ran a week later. Landlord loses property after years of violations. Tenants take ownership. The article didn't mention my name, but I didn't need it to. Seeing those words printed in black and white felt like vindication enough. The next time I passed Greg, months later, in a grocery store parking lot, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked thinner, paler, defeated. He mumbled something to himself and got into his car, driving off without a word. And as I stood there watching him leave, I didn't feel hate. I didn't even feel satisfaction in the cruel sense. I just felt done, finished, like the last thread connecting me to that fear had finally snapped. He had built his life on exploiting people who trusted him, people who thought fairness meant something. And in the end, it was that arrogance, that blind greed, that destroyed him. His downfall didn't come from someone more powerful. It came from the people he thought were powerless. And that was poetic justice in its purest form. A few weeks after Greg disappeared from our lives for good, the building felt different, lighter somehow. The air in the hallways no longer carried that anxious tension that had clung to it for years. Instead of muffled arguments behind closed doors, you could hear music, laughter, even the occasional sound of someone cooking with their door cracked open. We'd held our first official meeting as owners of Northside Tenants LLC in the small courtyard behind the building, the one that used to be overrun with weeds and broken furniture. Tom had mowed the grass that morning, Marco brought pastries from his bakery, and Mrs. Alvarez had brewed a pot of her famous cinnamon coffee. It smelled like home for the first time as we sat around a makeshift table, an old door propped up on crates. I looked around at the faces of the people who'd once been terrified of eviction. Now, they were board members, shareholders, decision makers, people with a voice. Carla, usually the quiet one, spoke first. "I still can't believe this is real," she said, laughing softly. "Last month I was crying over a rent increase, and now I'm signing off on plumbing repairs." Everyone chuckled, but there was emotion under it. Relief, pride, disbelief all at once. We'd already started fixing what Greg had ignored for years. The leaks in the roof were patched. The heating system was being replaced with a community grant. Even the peeling paint in the hallways had been covered with warm, cheerful colors the tenants had voted on together. When I looked up at the newly painted walls, I thought back to that night I'd sat by my window, staring out into the dark, wondering how I'd survive an 80% rent hike. It felt like a lifetime ago. After the meeting ended, I stayed behind for a while, helping Mrs. Alvarez clear the table. The evening sun was dipping low, casting golden light across the courtyard. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "You know, Mija, I always told you, people like him, they dig their own holes. You just handed him the shovel." I laughed, shaking my head. "I just wanted him to stop hurting people." "And you did," she said simply. Later that night, as I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I noticed something pinned to the bulletin board near the mailboxes. It was the county's official ownership certificate. Our certificate, with all our names printed neatly in black ink. I traced my fingers over it, feeling the texture of the paper. It wasn't about property or power. It was about justice. For so long, Greg had believed that owning something gave him the right to control people's lives. But real ownership, I'd come to realize, wasn't about holding deeds or titles. It was about responsibility, about taking care of what you have and who you share it with. A few days later, I got an email from the housing authority officer I'd spoken to months earlier. the woman with the sharp tone and kind eyes. Congratulations on the successful transfer. Cases like yours don't happen often, but they remind us why we do this work. Thank you for standing up. I sat back in my chair and let that sink in. Standing up, that's all it really was. Not revenge, not even rebellion. Just standing up when someone tried to push you down. The irony wasn't lost on me, though. Greg had raised the rent because he wanted more money, more control, more power. And in the end, that greed, that blind hunger for more, had cost him everything. The last I heard, he'd moved out of state. Someone mentioned he was trying to start over with another property management firm, but I doubted it would last. You can't build anything solid on exploitation. Sooner or later, it crumbles. As for us, our building thrived. Within a year, we'd managed to fully renovate the lobby and replace every broken fixture. The tenants became like family. We organized weekend potlucks, planted a small garden out back, even set up a shared library shelf in the hallway. Every time I walked through those doors, I felt a quiet sense of pride, not in winning against Greg, but in what we'd built after him. Justice hadn't just been served. It had grown roots, and in the end, I realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes karma doesn't show up as a dramatic showdown or divine punishment. Sometimes karma looks like peace, the kind that comes from reclaiming what someone tried to take from you and turning it into something better than it ever was before. I locked my apartment door, turned off the lights, and stood by the window, the same spot where months ago I'd sat, furious and scared. Now, I just smiled. The building was quiet, alive. Ours. Greg had wanted to own everything. But in the end, we were the ones who owned the building and our freedom. It's been 2 years since the day the county clerk handed us that deed. But I still catch myself smiling every time I unlock the front door. The brass handle glints in the morning light now, freshly polished. And the small plaque beside it reads Northside Cooperative Homes, established by residents, 2023. Every time I see it, I feel a quiet pulse of pride. Not because of what we took from Greg, but because of what we built in his absence. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The first few months were chaotic, learning to manage the finances, juggling repairs, scheduling inspections. There were nights when I'd sit at my dining table surrounded by invoices and spreadsheets, wondering if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. But then, little by little, the building began to change. The leaky pipes that Greg ignored for years? Fixed. The peeling paint and flickering lights? Gone. We repainted the hallways in soft creams and greens that made the place feel warm again. Marco's Bakery started supplying bread for our weekend breakfasts in the courtyard. Mrs. Alvarez organized a garden committee that somehow managed to coax real flowers out of the dry patch of dirt near the dumpsters, and every time I saw a small improvement, a brighter hallway, a repaired railing, a child's laughter echoing up the stairs, I felt the ghost of Greg's voice fade a little more. He had once ruled this building like a petty king, believing power was about control. But as we found our footing, I realized something deeper. Real power doesn't come from ownership. It comes from community, from knowing that when the ceiling leaks, someone will care enough to fix it. That when rent is due, no one's being squeezed. That everyone has a say. Last winter, the city invited us to speak at a housing justice forum. I remember standing at the podium, looking out at the rows of faces, landlords, tenants, city officials, and telling our story. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Afterward, A young woman came up to me. She said she'd been facing eviction from her own apartment and had been terrified to fight back. Hearing your story, she said, makes me believe it's possible. I don't think I've ever felt prouder in my life. Greg, as far as I know, never recovered. His properties were investigated, one by one, and he eventually filed for bankruptcy. The man who once bragged about owning half the block ended up selling the last of his assets to pay legal fees. I wish I could say I felt sorry for him, but I don't. Not because I hate him, but because he earned every ounce of what he got. It wasn't me or the tenants who destroyed him. It was his own greed, eating him alive from the inside out. Sometimes, I still remember his face the day of the auction, the disbelief, the arrogance cracking into fear, and I think about how poetic it all was. He raised my rent by 80%, thinking he could force me out. Instead, I stayed. I learned. I fought back. And now, I own the building. It's strange how justice works sometimes. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes it takes the shape of a signature on a deed. A garden blooming where bitterness once lived. A group of neighbors sharing coffee on a Saturday morning. One evening recently, as the sun was setting, I stood on the rooftop, freshly repaired and open now as a communal space. The city stretched out around me, golden in the light. Carla and Marco were setting up string lights for the weekend barbecue. Mrs. Alvarez was teaching a little girl how to water the plants, and Tom was fixing a loose hinge on the door. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. This was our new normal, one built on trust, shared effort, and quiet pride. When people ask me now what happened, how a group of tenants ended up owning the very building their landlord tried to take from them, I just smile and say, he taught us exactly how to beat him. Because in the end, Greg's biggest mistake wasn't greed. It was underestimating the people who paid his bills. He thought we were powerless. But the truth is, we were the foundation. And when the foundation decided to stand, his entire empire crumbled. Now, every time I walk through the lobby and hear the hum of laughter, smell the coffee brewing, or pass the plaque by the door, I'm reminded of something simple but profound. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes, it looks like peace, built with your own hands. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.